Private William Carter crouched in the shallow trench, his rifle resting on the damp, uneven earth. A faint drizzle hung in the air, settling on his helmet and shoulders in cold, needling drops. The mud beneath him sucked at his boots whenever he shifted, a slow reminder of the weeks he had spent sunk in this same earth. Somewhere beyond the jagged line of barbed wire, the enemy was out there, unseen, unheard, but certain. The fog was so thick that the world seemed reduced to the few feet of trench around him. Even the flicker of the occasional lantern down the line vanished into the mist as if swallowed whole. It wasn't silence exactly. Artillery in the distance rumbled like far-off thunder, but the noise had become part of the air they breathed, constant and unending. The war had been going on for months, though to William it felt like years. Days bled into nights, and nights into days, marked only by the cough of machine guns or the sudden scream that cut through the darkness. His fingers, numb from cold and weariness, twitched around the rifle's wooden stock. They trembled, though not entirely from fear. Fear had been a constant companion since the day he arrived in France, but tonight it was exhaustion that claimed the larger share of his strength. Sleep had long since become a luxury. The few minutes he managed to steal in the night were shallow and restless, always ready to be shattered by an officer's bark or the whistle of incoming shells. Food was another memory. The hard biscuits they were issued might as well have been stone, and the tinned meat carried a taste that clung to the mouth like oil. Even water was taken in ration sips, metallic from the canteen. William could barely remember the warm, filling meals of home, yet the thought of them returned sometimes without warning, like a cruel trick. Instinctively, his left hand went to his coat pocket. Beneath the coarse wool, his fingers brushed against a worn envelope. He felt the creases before he even saw it. The paper was soft now from constant handling, the edges beginning to fray. It was the last letter he had received from his younger sister, Emily, written in her neat, slanted handwriting. When he first opened it weeks ago, the scent of lavender had clung faintly to the paper, a trace of home carried across the sea. That fragrance was gone now, replaced by the faint musk of damp and earth. Still, the words remained. "Will, come home soon. Mum says the apple tree you planted is finally bearing fruit. We all miss you. The village feels empty without your laughter." He could picture her writing it, seated at the old oak table in their kitchen, her hair pulled back loosely the way she always wore it when she was busy. Outside the window, the orchard would be in bloom, the apple blossoms swaying in the spring breeze. He imagined the way the light would spill across the wooden floor, golden and warm, so different from the cold gray dawns here in the trenches. William had read those lines so many times that the ink had started to fade. He mouthed the words silently, almost like a prayer. The apple tree she mentioned was one he had planted with his father years ago, before the war. It had been little more than a sapling then, fragile and thin, and he'd worried it might not survive the winter frosts. The thought that it had not only lived but was now bearing fruit filled him with a quiet ache. He wished he could see it, touch its bark, feel the soil of his own land beneath his fingers. A faint rustle came from further down the trench, and William glanced toward it. The shapes of other soldiers moved in the dimness, adjusting their positions, cleaning weapons, speaking in low murmurs. The smell of tobacco drifted briefly on the air before vanishing into the damp. Somewhere to his left, a man coughed, a deep, wet sound that spoke of the sickness spreading among the ranks. The officers' rounds would come soon. Orders would be whispered, and perhaps, at dawn, another charge would be called. William had stopped asking whether they were gaining ground or merely surviving another day. Here, survival itself felt like victory. His thoughts returned to the letter. Carefully, he slid it back into his pocket, pressing it close to his chest as if its nearness could shield him from what lay ahead. He wondered what Emily would think if she could see him now, his uniform caked with mud, his face drawn and pale, the boy she had waved goodbye to replaced by a man who had seen too much. Above the trench, the rain began to fall harder, pattering against his helmet in a steady rhythm. He adjusted his grip on the rifle and stared out into the fog. Somewhere beyond it, The enemy waited for morning. And somewhere far beyond that, past the fields and towns and sea, an apple tree was in bloom. Captain Edward Whitmore moved with brisk authority along the narrow trench, the worn leather of his boots splashing through the ankle-deep mud. Rainwater dripped steadily from the brim of his cap, running down into the lines of his weathered face. Even in the gloom, the sharpness of his gaze was unmistakable. He had the look of a man who'd seen too many dawns that began with death. "Listen up." His voice cut through the murmur of the soldiers like a whip. Conversations died instantly. A few men straightened their backs. Others simply stared at him, their expressions hollow. "At first light," he continued, his words slow and deliberate, "we move forward. Intelligence says the enemy's position is weak. We take the ridge, we hold it, and we don't give it back." The sound of rain and the faint distant rumble of artillery filled the silence that followed. Somewhere further down the line, a tin mug clinked against a mess tin. Everyone knew the ridge. The high strip of ground that rose beyond the barbed wire had been the subject of whispers and rumors for weeks. It overlooked the valley like a watchful sentinel, and the enemy had fortified it with layers of sandbags, gun pits, and machine gun nests. Men who had tried to cross the open ground before had not returned. Calling it weak was like calling the North Sea a pleasant bathing spot, a bitter kind of soldier's humor. William Carter's eyes shifted toward the fog that lay heavy over no man's land, trying to imagine the ridge beyond it. He couldn't. The fog hid it, just as it hid what might happen to them in a few hours. Beside him, Tom, Hughes sat on an overturned ammunition crate, methodically cleaning his Lee Enfield rifle. His hands moved with calm precision, the cloth gliding along the oiled metal. Tom was a quiet man, the kind who didn't waste words, a farmhand before the war. His skin still carried the deep-weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. William had learned that Tom was married, though he rarely spoke of his wife except in short, understated remarks. "She bakes a good pie," or "she keeps the hens in order." There was something in his eyes, though, a faraway sadness that seemed older than the war itself. "This is suicide," Tom muttered without looking up, his voice barely more than a breath. William kept his own voice low, glancing toward the captain's retreating figure. "Maybe," he said. "But what choice do we have?" Tom's cloth paused for a moment, then resumed its steady rhythm. Somewhere beyond the trench walls, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. It was impossible to tell whether it came from their lines or the enemy's. A ripple of unease moved down the trench. Men checked their weapons, adjusted straps, tightened boots. Some whispered quiet prayers. Others stared blankly at the mud, lost in thoughts they would never speak aloud. Above them, the sky was a uniform sheet of gray, promising a dawn that would be anything but gentle. That night, sleep refused to come. The war had taught William Carter to fall asleep anywhere, anytime, but not tonight. The rain that had been falling since afternoon finally eased, leaving the air thick with damp and the heavy scent of wet earth. A dense fog rolled in from the valley, swallowing the stars one by one until the sky above was nothing but a pale, shapeless void. William sat with his back against the trench wall, the rough sandbags pressing into his shoulders. A small torch flickered weakly in the mud at his feet, its light trembling like it, too, feared the dark. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his breast pocket, a reply to the letter from his sister, Emily, and began to write in small, careful strokes. His hands were stiff from the cold, the pencil dragging across the page. "Emily, I can't promise I'll come home soon, but I carry you with me every step. Tell Mum I'm still her son, no matter what this war makes of me." He paused, staring at the words as if they were not quite enough, yet unable to find more. The torch sputtered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and shift across the trench walls. William folded the paper neatly, the motion slow, deliberate. He slid it into an envelope, though he knew it might never reach her. Out here, the post was a fragile promise. Letters often vanished between the front and home, swallowed by the same void that seemed to consume men in battle. Beside him, Tom Hughes sat with his rifle laid across his knees, humming softly to himself. The tune was low and steady, carrying through the mist like something half-remembered from childhood. William didn't recognize the words. They were likely from Tom's village, a place of green fields and quiet lanes, but the melody carried a weight that made his chest ache. For a brief moment, the war seemed far away. The machine guns were silent, the night still except for the hum of that song and the slow drip of water from the trench walls. William closed his eyes and let the sound carry him somewhere else, somewhere with open skies, sunlight on the grass, and the smell of fresh bread instead of cordite. When Tom's humming faded, the silence rushed back in, colder and heavier than before. The fog pressed close, and somewhere in the distance, a single gunshot cracked the night, a reminder that morning, and what it would bring, was not far away. At the first light of dawn, the whistle pierced the air, high, shrill, and impossible to ignore. William surged forward with the others, boots sinking deep into the mud, rifle gripped so tightly his knuckles burned. The fog that had clung to the ground all night began to tear apart under the chaos, revealing the dark outline of the ridge ahead. Then came the stuttering roar of machine guns. Bullets sliced through the air, snapping into the mud at their feet, kicking up wet clods. Men stumbled, fell, or simply crumpled where they stood. The screams mixed with the rattle of gunfire, making it impossible to tell where the voices ended and the battle began. The ground to William's left erupted in a shower of dirt and stone, the force rattling his teeth. Without thinking, he ducked and sprinted forward, his breath ragged in the cold air. Ahead, Tom Hughes threw himself behind the twisted trunk of a fallen tree, raising his rifle and firing in quick bursts toward the enemy's sandbag wall. William slid in beside him, chest heaving. His hands were already shaking, though he couldn't tell if it was from adrenaline or fear. "Keep moving." Captain Whitmore's voice boomed through the chaos. "We need to reach the sandbags." They pushed forward in short, desperate bursts, crawling when they couldn't run. The air stank of cordite, blood, and the acrid smoke from burning wood. A shell slammed into the earth nearby, the shockwave lifting William off his feet and throwing him into the mud. His ears rang violently, muting the world to a dull, distant roar. When his vision cleared, he saw Tom a few meters away, lying on his side, one hand clamped to his stomach. Blood pooled beneath him, dark against the churned earth. William dropped to his knees beside Tom, the mud soaking through his trousers. "Hold on. We'll get you back," he said, forcing the words out as if saying them might make them true. Tom's lips twitched into a faint, almost apologetic smile. "Not going back," he whispered, his breath shallow. "Listen, there's a letter in my pocket. For my wife, Sarah. Please give it to her." William shook his head. "Don't talk like that. You'll see her yourself." But Tom's gaze had already drifted past him, fixed on some unseen horizon. The lines of his face softened, and then he was still. For a long moment, the roar of battle dulled, as though the world had paused. William reached into Tom's coat, feeling the folded paper, still warm from his friend's body. He slipped it into his own pocket, pressing it flat against his chest as if to guard it with his life. Somewhere ahead, the gunfire raged on. Gritting his teeth, William picked up his rifle. The ridge loomed in the distance, its sandbag walls dark against the pale fog. The fight wasn't over. Not for him, and not for the promise he had just made. By midday, the survivors dragged themselves over the last stretch of churned earth and into the shelter of the sandbag line. The ridge was theirs at last. The enemy had melted away into the mist, leaving behind splintered rifles, twisted helmets, and the wreckage of their dugouts. Victory felt hollow. Captain Whitmore stood at the edge, boots planted in the mud, his eyes scanning the valley below. "We hold here," he said, his tone flat and final. "Reinforcements will arrive tomorrow." William found a rock half buried in the ground and lowered himself onto it, every muscle in his body aching. Around him, medics crouched beside the wounded, their hands red to the wrists. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid reek of smoke from burning timber. He reached into his coat and pulled out Emily's letter. The paper was crumpled now, edges soft from constant handling. But this time, his fingers were smeared with 2 shades of red, his own blood and Tom's. William stared at the neat, fading handwriting, letting the words blur in his vision. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the guns were silent for now. But the war was far from done. That night on the ridge stretched on without end. William lay in the damp hollow of the trench, staring into the darkness. Every so often, a burst of gunfire cracked in the distance, sharp and brief, then faded back into the heavy stillness. But the loudest sound came from within his own thoughts. Faces rose unbidden in his mind, each one framed by the moment they had fallen. Some were friends, others men whose names he'd barely learned. All of them were gone, yet here they were again, looking at him in the dark. He thought of Sarah Hughes, waiting in some quiet village, watching the road each evening for a figure that would never appear. He thought of Emily, still believing her brother might walk through the door one day, smiling, and see the apple tree heavy with fruit. In the early hours, the rain returned, soft at first, then steadier, soaking the ridge until it gleamed in the faint light of the moon. William closed his eyes, letting it run over his face, washing away the grit, the smoke, the blood. But no matter how cold or clean the rain, it could not touch the weight he carried inside. Weeks later, William was granted leave after a minor injury. His legs still ached from shrapnel, but he could walk. He traveled by train and bus, the countryside slowly replacing the barren warfront. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke instead of cordite. When he reached his village, children ran alongside him, shouting his name. Emily was waiting at the doorway, tears in her eyes. She threw her arms around him, and for a moment, William let himself believe he had left the war behind. That night, under the apple tree, he took out Tom's letter. The paper was crumpled, the ink smudged, but the words were still legible. He didn't open it. That wasn't for him. The next morning, he set out for the neighboring village, where Sarah lived. She opened the door slowly, recognition dawning in her eyes. "He's gone, isn't he?" she whispered. William nodded and handed her the letter. She clutched it to her chest, her face breaking into silent tears. William never told her what Tom's last words had been. Some truths were too heavy to pass on. But he knew that letter carried all the love and hope Tom had left. Months later, when the war finally ended, William returned home for good. He planted another apple tree beside the first one, a quiet tribute to the friend who hadn't made it back. Every year, when the trees bore fruit, he would sit beneath them with Emily, telling her stories of the people he'd known. And though he never spoke of the battle on the ridge in detail, the memory lived on in the letters, in the trees, and in the silence between words.